Welcome to the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast with Amy Wheeler. We're a global community of yoga therapists and related professionals who are sharing our knowledge and experience with one another to make the world a better place for all of us to thrive. On this podcast, we have deep and thought-provoking conversations that we hope will nourish you and make you feel more connected to yourself and to others. Feel free to continue these conversations on our private Facebook group called Yoga Therapy Hour Podcast with Amy Wheeler, and listen at the end of the podcast each week as we'll be giving away a special gift. Remember, we have a mobile app coming out May 2nd, 2022 that tracks mental health and so much more using the foundations of yoga and Ayurveda. Today, I interview Heather Mason from the Minded Institute in the UK. And I think you'll see in this interview that she is a powerhouse. She's doing so many amazing things in the world. And I think as you listen to the interview, you'll get a feel for her background, her studies, her credentials, her life experience. So what I want to talk about in the intro is the thing that I feel is most magnificent about Heather and inspirational, and the thing that I want to challenge all of us to step into, and that is being of service in the field of yoga therapy to the greater good. And I know that's hard, right? We all have mortgages to pay. Most of us are struggling to pay the bills. I know personally the pandemic has really made it difficult to run a yoga therapy school for the Optimal State Yoga Therapy School. We have less students, which means I can't pay the faculty as much, and I have to cut back on my precious COO, Krishna. There's real life problems. And in spite of those real life problems, can we still keep that vision for the field to help change the world? And this is what I think is magnificent about Heather, is that she is able to give of herself in a very different way than I see most people in the field. And that's not, a critique of anyone. It's just something to inspire us all. I think most people are thinking, what can I get out of this? If I pay you this money, are you going to teach me? And is there going to be a job guaranteed? And it feels very transactional and very small and very contracted. There's a lot of kind of I, me, mine ownership complex. And that actually is anti-yoga, right? What are we doing here? We are here to consciously evolve from the I to the we, from the small self with a small s into the realization that we are Purusha. We are radiant, all-knowing, eternal beings free of fear, what we might call the self with the capital S. That's what we're doing. And I think what's really difficult for many of us is to balance those two visions of, yes, I have to survive and pay the bills, and life is so hard, especially with COVID crisis and pandemic. And I also want to hold this higher consciousness for myself, for my work, for the field, for society, for the world, for the universe, right? And so I think when we get under a lot of stress, we tend to shrink down and only think about the I, me, mine. What am I going to get? How am I going to survive? And, kind of drop down into our lower fear-based chakras. And what I'm asking is, can we all work together, even though we feel those sensations, even though we feel that contraction, even though we look at the bank account and wonder, how is this going to work? And yes, we get worried about it. Can we simultaneously hold all of that and the greater vision and volunteer some of our time and create space in the heart, in the throat, in the intuition, in the crown chakra, can we also keep conscious about staying open? I'm not going to say we can get rid of the fear completely. I'm not saying we should bypass it. I'm not saying we should pretend it's not there. I'm not saying like money is magically going to, fall from the sky and pay our bills for us. That's not real. But can we simultaneously, at the same time, through meditation practice, really open ourselves up to the possibility that we and our communities can contribute towards the advancement of consciousness of the world? And the reason that's so important, in spite of all the difficulties that most of us are facing, the reason that's important is because even if we can't decrease the fear, when we increase the salutogenesis, or some people call it the eudaimonia, when we increase that, it balances things out. It gives us more resilience. It gives us more energy, more prana to help deal with the difficulties. I think so many of us just shut down into the dukkha, the contraction of the heart space, and we forget that we have this amazing tool over here that will actually help us have more sukha, more expansion, more openness. And even though the difficulties are there, if we kind of get up into that higher consciousness, it will help us deal with the difficulties. And this is not why we do it, but I believe that it even changes our perception. It changes our blood chemistry. It changes our neurochemicals so that our perception of the world and the world's perception of us actually shifts, and that good things are more likely to happen in that state, which ultimately could help you with those lower chakra issues of trauma from all of our childhoods that tend to come up. So that's not why we're doing it. It's like this added amazing bonus, like, oh my gosh, here I am focusing on being of service and wanting to give to the world. And that's good. That's what we need to do. And it has this added bonus of helping me deal with my dukkha. So I just want to put that out there because I think Heather's a remarkable example of someone who is giving to society. She's helping to push the field forward. And I think that's very different than sitting on the sidelines and throwing rocks at glass houses, complaining about why I didn't get me mine, what are you going to do for me today kind of thing. The field cannot grow from those lower chakra states. It can't. And we all need to put our minds and our hearts together to move this forward because we have something so precious, so special, as Heather is going to describe in the interview today. The research is coming out. It's already out there to show that what we do works and the world needs us. Now, sure, there's a little time gap here where that's coming forward and people are starting to recognize that. It might even be 5, 10, 15 years before the full fruition of it happens. But we all need to have that bhavana or that intention now. It's like a little seed that is under the dirt that nobody knows is about to pop up, and it's going to pop up soon, and then it's going to grow and blossom. But it actually needs our prana, our life force, our attention, our volunteer hours, our heartfelt meditative experiences where we put good thoughts towards the field of yoga therapy to help it pop out of the dirt and be the little seedling that will eventually flower and blossom. So that is my challenge to you. I think Heather will inspire you with her actions and her seriousness about pushing the field of yoga therapy forward. So enjoy this interview. Welcome, Heather, my dear friend. I'm so honored that you are here on the Yoga Therapy Hour podcast to just engage and be present and tell us about some of the latest brain science research. I know that you did a lot of making sure you are 100% up to speed for this interview. So anybody who's watching, stay tuned because Heather is really going to wow us with the latest research in brain science.
No pressure then.
No pressure, Heather. But before we go there, Heather,
Okay.
you're such a lovely woman. I came and visited you with Matt Taylor in London and saw your Minded Institute, which is amazing. You have big vision. You're getting it done. But let's back all the way up. How did you get interested in yoga therapy?
So it's quite a story. And first of all, I think it's important to say that I think inherent within me has always been an interest in Eastern traditions, not just yoga, Buddhism, Chinese, different traditions, Tai Chi, Qigong, like all of that. Where that came from, I cannot say. It certainly did not come from friends and family. It led me to believe as a young person that reincarnation was definitely true, because where else were my beliefs rising from? Anyway, I had mental health issues, tumultuous background, and from the age of 10 to 23, disintegrating mental health. And at the age of 23, I'm just going to be very direct. I decided two things. Either I would get out and find a way to heal myself, because I did not want to go the pharmaceutical route. And I'm not anti-medication. I want all the listeners to know that. I simply didn't want it for myself, because everybody I knew was medicated. Or I was going to take my life. These were the options I was facing at 23. I know it sounds starkly morbid, but it was. Anyway, first I went to Southeast Asia and then to Korea. And very quickly, I ended up living full-time in Buddhist monasteries. And I also already had a yoga practice, Amy, from the age of 19. I studied abroad in India, had some very interesting experiences that led me to that moment, but it's probably another interview. And I don't think that yoga hit me correctly at that time, because I was an ex-gymnast and there was no philosophy being embedded in it, or pranayama or meditation. So I was like, oh, adult gymnastics, yay! I can do all these things and show off, at 19, the same way I did when I was 12. Anyway, it wasn't until living in Buddhist monasteries and also ashrams that I really came into contact with the power of yoga. And having lived in monasteries doing intense meditation, watching the mind, it was vital for me to move. And also it helped me to keep my mind still and present. When you have mental health issues, I recommend to nobody they do what I did, which was meditate 12 to 16 hours a day in silence for months on end. But I did do that. That was my path. And then I was going to become a Buddhist nun, came to London. You hear the American accent, but I'm actually based in the UK in Buddhist studies. And the objectification of something that was so embodied for me made me uncomfortable. I then went to teach yoga instead, full-time in Taiwan.
Can we stop for 1 minute?
Yes, sorry.
Just unpack that little statement, the objectification of something that meant so much to you, like just a tiny glimpse of what that means to you.
So, when I was doing a master's degree at the School of Oriental and African Studies, which is part of London University, for which I have great esteem for, we were looking at all of the philosophical elements objectively, as though we were anthropologists investigating a culture that engendered particular beliefs and textually writing about it and going through the history as though it was divided from us. Mm. And I was interested in studying Buddhism from the perspective of how it had transformed my mind. And I remember my professor, he had a very difficult name, Tadushki, saying to me, Skoropsky, that was his last name, Dr. Skoropsky, saying, are you a missionary on this course? Like, you seem to be wanting to convince everybody to meditate. That's not where we're here. We're here to investigate the tradition that gave rise to this and to make commentary on textually where these things came from. And I was like, no, we're here to talk about how Buddhism can transform people. And he was like, did you get lost? You were very academic. I could see that, in your undergrad. I think you're in the wrong place. And he was right. I was in the wrong place. But I learned a lot. Well, my dissertation was on the psychological transformative elements inherent within Buddhism. So I kind of, meandered my way out. But I realized very quickly that I didn't want to do a PhD in Buddhist studies, for example, because if I didn't go back to the monastery to be a nun, I thought maybe I would do that. And I didn't want to. I wanted to go back to the embodied practice. And I wanted to offer other people that as well. When I left London, I went to Taiwan and I taught yoga full time. And I was interested in teaching yoga to people because I found that people could more easily understand how to be present with challenging sensations and transform their relation to it by staying in a position and asking them to close their eyes and do the same with their mind. So it was an easy inroads. But then they would come to me at the end of class and they'd say, how do I have what you have? And I would say things like, well, I lived in Buddhist monasteries for 3 years in silence. Why don't you do that too? And I remember people would like back, you know how you back up slowly when you think someone's insane and then you run? And that was my response from others. So I then came back to London and I decided to do a master's degree in psychotherapy. I wanted to have the language in order to help other people. And while I was doing that, I think at the end of the second year, I felt like a fraud. It's not that I'm anti-talking therapy, and any psychological talking therapist listening to that, please know that I do value your profession, but it wasn't my path. And since what I was doing was taking my learning into the life of other people, I was hoping this didn't seem to align with that, right? It was out of concert. And so I then went to India again. That's where I did my first yoga teacher training. I forgot to mention that during my 3 years in the Buddhist monasteries. I did that in 2001. So I went back to India and I did a yoga therapy training in 2007. And I realized I actually had this kind of epiphany moment. You know, I know some people have those epiphany moments. I was driving back. It was like the only time we were allowed out of the ashram. I, of course, went to get sugar, milk sweets, because of my addiction to this. Right. I admit it.
Most important things.
And as I'm driving back in the taxi to the ashram, I saw it clearly that I should not be working as a yoga therapist for all health conditions, that I should be working as a yoga therapist for mental health. And suddenly before me, and this is true, I saw an 8-week course. It was just like, I saw the weeks. I saw how each week would be divided. And when I finished, I came back to London, went back to my psychotherapy training because I still had a year left to complete it. And I immediately created this course. And it was listed in Time Out in the UK before I even started it, which to me says something like, you know, if you're walking the right direction, doors open. And my first course was successful and it kept building. This yoga therapy for anxiety and depression 8-week course. And the students actually taught me what the course needed, more so than my a priori perspective on that, right? Their insights developed the course. I used to call them my little angels, and they were. And then when the course was codified, so many people came to me and said, can you teach us what you do? Can you teach us what you do? And so the training organization, which was then called Yoga for the Mind, but is now called the Mind Institute, it changed its name the second year in, was born of request. The first year, it was just for people that wanted to use yoga therapy for mental health populations. And from the second year, it became much more expansive into what it is now.
What I find really interesting about this is that you and I both teach yoga therapy for mental health. And in my mind, that's a way to say, look, we're not going to be doing a ton of hard yoga postures. Yoga therapy is really about your mind. It's about your perception. It's about your self-regulation. It's about your self-awareness. It's about your self-actualization, which is all mental. And that's not to say that we don't actually do some wonderful postures to keep it embodied. And as you said, to actually feel the sensations, because it's easier to have a one-pointed focus on that than for a lot of people than having it, you know, just watching your own thoughts. It's more gross, more tangible. But I think that's why I think all yoga therapy actually is about the mind. If we're really looking at yoga philosophy, it is about the mind. What do you think?
I wholeheartedly agree. and I think that there are many different inroads in order to get to that essence of mind. And it sometimes requires the body. It often requires altering breathing practices and diet, attitude, all of those things, habit. I guess attitude is mind. But ultimately, yes. And I mean, that's what yoga is, the second sutta and the Yoga Suttas that many of the people listening probably know, yoga, chitta, vritti, nirodha. It's all about the mental shifts that can occur. And likewise, when the mind changes, everything else also transforms. I believe that, because I know we were going to talk about neuroscience, and this is an interesting place to just add a tidbit that I'd like to say we can move on because it works really well here. So there was a really interesting paper that was published in June. Sarah Lazar was on the team. If anybody doesn't know Sarah Lazar, she was made famous from the publication in 2005, where she demonstrated that long-term mindfulness meditators have thicker parts of their brain, like the prefrontal cortex and insular cortex, than non-meditators. And that seminal paper in 2005 sparked an entire corpus of other research within the mindfulness world and has led to a lot of neurocorrelates and meditation. Anyway, she was on this paper. She was not the primary author. If anyone wants to look it up, it's Singleton. And what they did was they were looking at how controls, so non-yogis and non-mindfulness meditators, were showing on what they were calling ego development versus people who practice meditation and people who practice, and specifically mindfulness, and people who practiced yoga. And ego development for them was not what we would imagine, like becoming more egotistical, but moving from a place of being very self-centered to being conscious of self, to being conscientious, to becoming very clear of one's effect on the world, to recognizing that self is a myriad of different aspects, and being able to hold the hypocrisies that we each individually have, as well as everybody else, and start aligning really clearly one's morals with one's actions. So there is this, like you use the term, self-actualization. And what they discovered was that although both yogis and mindfulness meditators had higher levels of ego development, and they also were looking at things like the default mode network, which is, for anybody listening, is part of the brain associated with rumination and self-referencing. It's a whole network of structures that are more kind of cortical and medial, which means sort of towards the top of the brain and somewhat central. Yogis were less ego developed, people practicing more asana, than people doing the mindfulness meditation that were actually looking at their mind. And that allowed for greater development. It also allowed for greater compassion. And when I read that article, I thought, as a trainer of yoga therapists, I want to make sure that they themselves are practicing more meditation. Right. Because otherwise, yes, they know all this stuff, but they go in there with clients and they really can't hold the distinction between who they are and who a client is, and make this broad container for transformation. Anyway, it just fit really well into what we were saying, the mind.
I love what you're saying. I just said to my new group that just started last night. Well, we started a few weeks ago, but I was just saying, like, if you're not doing your own practice, if you don't have a mentor that's helping you go in the direction that you just talked about, Heather, what are we doing here? This idea of training yoga therapists completely on a intellectual level is not okay with me. That's not going to work. We have to unpeel the onion of our own consciousness over multiple years in order to help someone else unpeel their onion that has the consciousness within. And, that it kind of makes me sad that the asana-based yoga people, didn't have higher consciousness compared to the mindful meditators. But, it's probably true. And my question was, is that self-selection, right? Are the people who really love hard asana, are they at a different level of consciousness? And the people who are really attracted to the mindfulness are closer to oneness, if you will. Like, what do you think? Was it self-selected, or do you think it was a result of the practices they did during the study?
Did you actually write the paper? Because that's exactly the questions they asked in the discussion. Exactly. And I'm really curious to see if they will repeat this study with a before and after element. But it'll need to probably be like a few years, because it's one thing to see a change in connectivity of the brain, and it's one thing to see even anatomical changes, but to see those profound psychological shifts take time because they're staged. But that was exactly what they wanted to know. Are people who are more developed in those particular ways more drawn towards mindfulness meditation? Just for the yogis, so that you know, they came up higher on fluid intelligence. And for anybody unaware of the meaning of that term, it's essentially the capacity presented with new data to respond from innovative ways. And that probably relates, you know, to some of the research that we look at, like how the starting and stopping of asana, for example, over and over, increases networks between certain parts of the brain that are able to excite and inhibit, excite and inhibit. And yogis really develop that. And so their ability to be like, wait, not this, let me look this way, let me look this way, that was stronger than the mindfulness meditators.
That's fascinating. And I would think, you know, that's essentially what we teach people to do in yoga therapy, to regulate their autonomic nervous system, to get excited in body, mind, and spirit, and then realize, oh, I'm going too high. Let's bring it back down. Or, whoa, I have gone way too low. I need to pull up a little bit. And so that's a really cool finding to show that working with the body might help learn how to do that.
I agree. It's super cool, especially because it's a very difficult faculty to develop at will. And so to be able to do it through the body, rather than say, okay, I'm going to teach my mind to just respond differently, to inhibit, to be excited, to initiate. It's tough. I mean, imagine we could just do that at will. We'd all be like blissed out. We wouldn't need any practice.
I think it's possible. I just think it's a much higher order skill. To do it in your body is kind of more gross and tangible again.
Yes.
And to watch your own mind and catch those fluctuations early, that's like a whole nother level of refinement, I think.
And it takes a longer time, I believe. Yeah. And based on my lived experience as well, it's harder to do it through mind than through body. Yeah.
What other studies can you tell us about the influence of yoga on brain functioning? Is there any other ones that just really stand out to you that we all need to know?
Well, I have my faves, which are not necessarily new, and then I'll go to new, but I have my like old faithful that are absolutely my favorite. So Chris Treater's research, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Amy, which is a bunch of different trials. That's my favorite stuff. She demonstrated that practice of yoga in 2007 could increase GABA, which is the major inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain, and pervasive throughout many, many different neurons in the brain. So neurons can give off different kinds of neurotransmitters, and GABA is very pervasive, whereas glutamate, the excitatory neurotransmitter, is also very pervasive in the brain. And she demonstrated that 1 hour of yoga practice could increase GABA. And that's highly meaningful because many health populations are suffering from low levels of GABA. Those populations include, and this is not an exhaustive list, depression, anxiety, PTSD, epilepsy, chronic pain, and certain somatosensory disorders as well. And the reason she wanted to investigate GABA, which is actually very expensive to scan, was that she, as both a psychiatrist and a neurologist and a professor, it's a unique combination of skills, was like, okay, so the people with these different diagnoses are being given, in some cases, medication that mimics or increases the cellular affinity for GABA. And they're also improving with yoga. So is there a common element that GABA might actually be increasing in the practice of yoga? And that's what she found. She was critiqued for her work, that there was no active control, and she really took the bull by the horns. So in 2010, she was like, I'm not just going to compare something. I'm going to compare a metabolically matched group that walks, metabolically matched meaning that the physical exertion was perceived to be equal to the Iyengar yoga that she was teaching, or had other people teaching, I should say. And it was in a group environment where people were silent. So a lot of things were matched. And yoga came up again, statistically significantly better at spiking GABA than the walking group. Then she came up with this brilliant hypothesis with one of my mentors, Dr. Patricia Gebhardt, who's like family to me, where the two, because Pat is also a psychiatrist, where the two hypothesized that actually increasing GABA not only inhibited certain things like the fear network, which is one of the reasons it seems to be so potent for many populations around mental health, but that actually through continual spiking of GABA through the practice of yoga, there could be a reorganization of circuitry in the brain, most notably within a structure known as the insular cortex, that has to do with our perception of our body and would lead to a clearer self-perception. The best example would be, if we were anorexic, we would perceive ourselves as large, even if we were emaciated. And that's just incongruent with reality. So through the practice of yoga and then a heightening of GABA, circuitry within the insula would shift. And in this theoretical case I've just given, one would wake up one morning, or maybe over many, many mornings, and say, oh, I'm emaciated. So that whole series of research she's done to me is extremely exciting. And she published at the beginning of 2020 another paper showing that in a depressed population, likewise, the practice of yoga increased GABA and was associated with reduced levels of depression. So that's one of my favorites.
And can I just say that's amazing that you can do yoga and increase hormones and chemicals and neurotransmitters naturally with no side effects like that. That's just so, I know we all know that, but if you just take a moment to take that in, that's so cool.
It's super big. And you know what else is really, really interesting about that is that if you are prescribed psychopharmaceuticals, again, I'm not anti them, over time, you will need to increase your dosage in order to experience the same effect. Whereas the evidence that we currently have shows that if you continue a yoga practice, you actually pump more of that stuff out with less effort. Right. So endogenously, internally, leads to greater amounts over time, and exogenously, externally, you need to keep upping your dosage. And unfortunately, like it or not, medications have side effects. I remember when I studied pharmacology and we started the first day and the professor was like, no matter how much I love pharmacology, pharma does more damage than good. And I was like, okay.
Ouch.
It was like, why are we even in this class then? Why are you teaching it? But anyway, and along the same vein, bringing in another new paper. So Mahalakshmi, I love that name, Mahalakshmi, published something in the last 18 months. It's really a heavy article. So I don't recommend that everybody necessarily read it. He's looking at synaptic plasticity. So synaptic plasticity, I have to go into that first, right? Mm-hmm. So a synapse is like the space between two neurons where they're sending information. And synapses have like receptor sites where they can pick up the chemicals that are being sent. And synapses have these things that pick up. We could think of them as like tentacles called dendrites. Sorry for getting complicated here, everybody. And dendrites, just one more level, have these things called spines. They're the stuff that really sticks out. And Mahalakshmi was saying that one of the things that makes yoga so incredibly interesting for mental health issues that may not remit is that when you rebalance certain neurochemicals within the brain organically, you enhance, he calls it the integrity of these dendritic spines, and you allow for the overall efficiency of the brain to improve. And the examples of conditions for which this could be beneficial, right? This is not a claim that it is, were autism, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder, where you have a diversity in how the brain is functioning. And essentially, through changing the neurochemical environment, you might be able to remove some of these symptoms that are causing the person high level stress. Not to say that the diagnosis would change, but I thought that was like so exciting and cutting edge. That article, though, you have to sit there with like Wikipedia and an encyclopedia every other word.
Well, thank you for breaking it down to the basics for us, because I think this is the type of thing that we would want to get a copy of. And you can probably go on PubMed or somewhere and get a free copy, I'm sure.
Yeah, you can.
And even if you didn't understand every word in it, you could give it to a doctor. You could give it to a psychiatrist and say, look at the latest research on autism, schizophrenia, and bipolar. People who are experiencing those symptoms, like that is really, because they would understand all of the difficult words in there.
Although they would have to go back to their biochem days in medical school, like even they would be sitting there and I think needing some support with some of the terminology. Yeah, but they would get it and they would be like, yeah, that's a really interesting perspective, especially psychiatrists.
The thing that blows my mind, Heather, is Western science is Mahalakshmi is putting this study out within the last 18 months. But the yogis knew this. They may not have had the anatomical terms and the special equipment to measure all of this, but they knew it. They could see it as real lived experience. And I think, just knowing that people were doing these types of things up to 2,000 years ago, and they're still working today is remarkable.
It's amazing. One of my teachers used to say that it's not as remarkable as we think because, and this takes a bit of a leap of faith, he said the ancient yogis could see inside their own brains. They had the capacity through all of this practice in order to look at their own organs. And they were able, through this really rarefied state of mind or states of mind, to be able to actually see what we call the brain. They would have maybe had different terminology, and see how pranayama were leading to chemical changes. So he said it's not as novel as you think. They saw it. They just didn't have our instruments of measurement, just direct observation.
Yes. And they were at such a high level of consciousness that knowledge could be obtained, whereas we are distracted. We're running around on the bus system and we're feeding our pets, and we're just not at that level anymore.
No, I agree. We have a disease of distraction.
Mm-hmm. Well, I also know that you are a lover of breathwork and pranayama, and you have a serious practice that you personally do for yourself every day, but you're also an expert in all the latest research on that. So tell me, why don't we start with your morning sessions, your breathwork experienced by Heather, and then we'll move it outward into some of the research.
So my breathwork morning sessions, they vary so much, Amy. I really feel like I wake up in the morning and I have a sense of where's my mind at and what do I need? Sometimes it's slow and gentle, like coherent breathing or jai. Sometimes I'm doing Kapalabhati because I need that lift. Sometimes Wim Hof, which I know isn't technically pranayama, but really it is a form of pranayama. And I developed for myself a 1-hour technique, which when I have time, I generally do. I can explain why. So I actually start first. Maybe I'll say what it is and then I'll explain why. I start with Wim Hof. I am a fan of that technique personally. I don't necessarily think it has a place in everybody's yoga therapy, but I like it for me. Then I do 20 minutes of coherent breathing. Then I do Wim Hof. Then I do alternate nostril breathing. So why ever would somebody do so many different techniques and so many intense ones? So from my perspective, Wim Hof is very interesting.
Could you describe Wim Hof? Because I'm not sure people even know what.
Oh, sure. So generally it's done in a lying position, which is unique for many pranayama. And one breathes through the mouth, again, unique for many pranayama. And one breathes quite intensely and rapidly. So it looks like this. It's not as strong as Bhastrika in that you're pushing the air out. So it's not, it's more like that. And when you start, you would do 30 rounds like that. And then after the exhale, you would hold your breath out for as long as you can. Following holding your breath out, you would inhale through the mouth, hold the breath in for 30 seconds, but you don't want to hold the breath into the maximal capacity for breath holding because you have something called the Herring-Breer reflex, where if you have too much oxygen in your lungs, your body wants to exhale. It activates that, so it's hard to hold the breath. And then as soon as you finish that, you do 2 more rounds of the same nature. So why do I do this? So first of all, when you breathe in that fashion, you let go of a lot of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide gets a bad rap. Anybody that knows anything about TACO these days will know that carbon dioxide is actually not bad for you. It's the levels that are challenging, right? You can reach levels in the blood where it's too high, but generally not a result of breathing. But you do get rid of really high levels of carbon dioxide doing this. As a result of this, you can hold the breath out for a long period of time because it's not actually a reduction in oxygen that first and foremost causes us to breathe. It's increased levels of carbon dioxide. The brain stem is constantly scanning for increased levels of carbon dioxide, or one of the things that breaks down from that, which is extra hydrogen molecules, right? So constantly looking for that. And so you can hold it out for a long time. And then when you inhale, because oxygen levels were low, it's like that's sucked into all of the cells, picked up very quickly by the hemoglobin. All right. Now, the reason I'm interested in this technique is that rapid breathing has the potential to increase levels of glutamate. So glutamate, if you remember, is really the opposite of GABA. It's the major excitatory neurotransmitter in the brain. Now, certainly not everybody is going to want to increase glutamate levels. Doing so, and this is one of the reasons it's contraindicated in many kinds of yoga therapy, can lead to fear-based states. It can activate the amygdala. So again, not for everybody, rapid breathing practices in general. But when we increase glutamate levels, what happens is we enhance the encoding of new pathways very quickly. So those rapid breathing practices, just like the texts teach us, are expedient ways to shift what's going on in the brain. So if you were to pair a rapid breathing practice with positive thinking, you may be able to create very quickly new neural networks. But again, you have to be stable enough to be able to maintain and manage that.
And can we just stop there for a moment? Because I think that's where yoga therapy comes in. We've done an assessment. We understand the history of this person, both mentally, physically. We get an idea of are they stable enough to take in this excitatory response? Because if you're already highly what we'll call rajas or in your sympathetic nervous system, putting more on top of that isn't going to be great, right? So
absolutely. And, we see a similar pattern happen during traumatic events, which is why that trauma is so quickly encoded. So anybody with anxiety, anybody with trauma would be at grave risk of doing this, not to mention anyone with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia where the glutamate network is aberrantly acting. So, we need to be very cautious and, like you said, do an intake. But there are populations that would certainly benefit from this, especially people that come to you that have been doing yoga for a while, are stable in some ways, but have beliefs that they cannot shift, are really suffering from those beliefs. Like, for example, I'll be very honest here. I have had PTSD. I have remnants of that. I have things I cannot shift. And this is why I choose to do this kind of practice. It's not just like general health maintenance. It's me recognizing that I've plateaued in certain ways and I need to keep working that process. So after the Wim Hof, I then do coherent breathing, which is actually really useful for many different health populations. And coherent breathing involves inhaling for a count of 6 and exhaling for a count of 6, which means that one breath cycle is 12 seconds. And if you divide 60 by 12, you get 5. So 5 breaths a minute. Now this pranayama, we could call it, right? But it's, again, more of a modern invention, we could say, in some ways.
It's a ratio.
It's a ratio.
Yeah.
Is I use it for a number of reasons. One is that it is known to increase heart rate variability, which is a vital measure of autonomic flexibility. That's one of the reasons it's going to be very good for many health populations. It tends not to have many contraindications. And although people may struggle at the beginning to lengthen the inhale and exhale to that level, it doesn't cause many issues. Just for people considering using it therapeutically, asthma may be one condition where it's not appropriate, long COVID, current COVID, situations where breathing is problematic to begin with. But generally, it's really good. It's also really good for cardiovascular conditions because in affecting heart rate variability, we're also improving cardiovascular well-being. So I do that next.
Can I jump in here too?
Yeah.
There's a wonderful researcher out of Italy named Luciano Bernardi. Yeah, who showed the efficiency of delivering oxygen to the cells at this rate that you just mentioned is most efficient. Even if you have a longer breath pattern, like a 12 count inhale, a 12 count exhale, it's not as efficient as a 6-6. He basically says 5-5 or 6-6, kind of in that range. And I think you probably know he had a study where he had people hike up Mount Everest, and that the climbers that made it to the top were the ones that were breathing in that range. The ones that were taking longer breaths or shorter breaths didn't make it to the top. Isn't that amazing? So that goes to exactly what you were saying about, the functioning of the metabolism and actually delivering oxygen. It's real.
Yeah, it's very real. I actually did a small research study with Luciano Bernardi, and he taught me so much. I got to speak to him all the time, spent some time in Italy with him. And just if people want to know, but I could move on because I know we don't have lots of time, I can explain very briefly why the 5-5 is more important than any other ratio for the uptake of oxygen. Or I can move on, Amy, whatever you'd like.
I want to hear it. Let's do it.
Okay. All right. So it has to do with something that we call ventilation and perfusion matching. So ventilation, for our intents and purposes now, is when the air is in the lungs. And perfusion is when the blood is arising maximally to the lungs. Now you may imagine, right, and it makes sense, the blood is always flowing through evenly, but that's not true because it's pumping, right? And right after a left ventricle pump, you have the maximum amount of blood, right, that can actually pick up the hemoglobin within the blood, the oxygen. So it is at exactly this rate of 5-5 or 6-6 that the maximal amount of air is in the lungs at the same time that the maximal amount of blood is arriving at the lung wall. And so that means that this breath is not just useful for the reasons I mentioned, but for people with COPD, for people with any kind of issue where oxygen uptake is problematic, like heart failure as well. So yeah, it's amazing. And the ancient yogis knew that. So I do that, then I repeat the Wim Hof because I've made my system even more flexible now with that heart rate variability. And then I really want to use it to transform the way I perceive reality. And then after that, I go to alternate nostril breathing. And the reason I do that, although there are many different health benefits of alternate nostril breathing, is that you are rarefying the flow of air, reducing oxygen levels, and increasing carbon dioxide. The exact opposite of what you're kind of doing in Wim Hof. And when you increase carbon dioxide, in a given session, you vasodilate the blood vessels, which helps with oxygen delivery. But there's also a correlation between greater carbon dioxide tolerance, of course, at healthy levels, and overall psychological resiliency. So I want to do that. Likewise, because your brain has more carbon dioxide than usual and a little less oxygen as usual, it brings you front and center because your brain's like, wait a second, what are you doing with my gas levels? And so you end the session of all this breathing incredibly present and focused, especially if the alternate nostril breathing you're doing includes a breath hold in between, which I do. And then I'm set up for meditation in this, like I imagine, significantly shifted neurochemical environment. So that's my practice.
It's beautiful, beautiful. And I think doing that first thing in the day, you shift your neurochemical resiliency probably for the entire day, because how we start out perceiving the day, kind of things either roll downhill or they go uphill, right?
Yeah, they can elevate. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, that's magnificent. And again, this is for you who's been a longtime meditator. You have a stable constitution. You eat well. I mean, we wouldn't throw
Except
this
the
out.
sugar.
We wouldn't throw this out to people with significant mental health conditions that don't have a yoga, breathing, and meditation background. We just want to be clear about that.
Yeah. For them, my starting point is generally just the elongation of the exhalation. It's very potent. Right. It activates, so the vagus is coming out of the brainstem, and one of its points is down to the heart, the sinoatrial node. And every time we elongate the exhalation, the vagus sends more input to the heart. And that input is acetylcholine, which reduces the beating of the heart. And when the heart rate is reduced, that is picked up as calming. And so it has a knock-on effect. And it helps people to relax. And it has, when you reduce sympathetic drive or that anxiety drive, there's also this potential for seeing things differently, for feeling better. And this comes to another research study that I was looking at, which was actually saying one of the reasons that yoga allows new learning, which is so important that it offers, is because it decreases stress enough that can happen. You can't have more body awareness. You can't improve your memory unless actually you're not constantly worrying about survival mode. And so it brings that down, and then it jointly enhances other faculties like memory networks in the brain, as well as enhancing the very structures like the hippocampus associated with it, so that memory can improve. And then it activates things like the insular cortex involved in how we perceive our felt sense, so that we can oh, this is my body. This is what it feels like. Oh, and I thought it was scary, but actually it's okay. It's safe because I'm not frightened.
I love what you said about if you're at a certain high level of stress, you actually can't learn new things, because I think this is the problem for health behavior change. I used to work in a health education department at Lutheran General Hospital long ago.
Oh,
and
wow.
we would give people okay, you need to eat this and you need to exercise and you need to do this. And the compliance or the adherence was horrible. But this is why. And this is why if yoga therapy was put into every health education department at every hospital in the world, so that people could first decrease their stress so they could actually have a shot at health behavior change. And actually, that's where I think that yoga could really get into the healthcare system and be adopted. If we could just explain that to people, that all the education in the world, health education, isn't going to do anything if they're stressed out.
I wholeheartedly agree. No, I wholeheartedly agree. And I think even on top of that, we're not going to engage as a society in pro-social behaviors if we're frightened. The very neurochemicals associated with bonding and associated with looking outside our narrow framework are not on board in the same way when we're stressed out. So it's a healthcare thing, it's compliance to health interventions, but it's also, how are we going to respond better as human beings? Because look at the crises facing us.
This ahankara, the I, me, mine, ownership, got to keep myself safe, that is going to destroy society. It is destroying society. And it's all because of the amygdala and the brain chemistry just trying to keep us safe. So, yeah. When we say yoga is like the solution to many problems, and my brother teases me and says, oh, you're proselytizer of yoga. And I'm like, yeah, I am, because it's amazing. So,
yeah. Do you know that article that, what is it, Alison Ross wrote? I am a nicer person, but I do yoga. That was the name of the paper.
That's right.
and that was borne out in actual qualitative research. That wasn't just oh, I love yoga, so I'm going to write this paper. That was the theme that came out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think we all have experienced that in our lives, right?
Absolutely.
So, Heather, you are doing some remarkable, groundbreaking work in the UK, bringing yoga therapy into healthcare, into academia, into psychology. Like, tell us, I can't even wrap my head around what one woman is doing in the UK single-handedly. Not that you don't have a whole team and support, and I know you have a lot of great people that work with you, but this is your vision. What's happening?
Okay, so first of all, it's yoga more than yoga therapy right now that is starting to enter into the health system in the way that it's aligned with what we call the community sector in the UK. So that's happening through social prescribing. So just to clarify that a little bit more, because I'm sure social prescribing is not a phrase known internationally, even though it is. Yeah.
You have to even describe I didn't know what that meant until I came to visit you in London.
To be fair, a lot of people in London don't know what it is. So social prescribing is based on the insight that social isolation is a risk factor for many health conditions for two reasons. One, when we are isolated, we are known to engage in poor health behaviors that put us at risk for a whole host of lifestyle conditions. We don't eat as well. We don't move as well. We engage in substances of misuse more often, right? Where in contrast, when we are in a community where we feel safe, and that's really important. It's not just community, it's community where we feel safe. We tend to engage in more positive health behaviors. And in addition to that, there is a co-regulation of the nervous and cardiovascular systems that actually occurs when we are in safe bonded relationships, and Stephen Porges talks all about that, right? So I won't go down that rabbit hole of the social engagement system, but it is beautiful research.
And can I tell you, Stephen Porges has agreed to come on the podcast?
Oh, yay!
Yeah, so we'll talk more about that at the end of March is when that one will come out. Okay,
so that's like a little shout out to him in advance. Hi, Stephen. So for that reason, it makes sense that people are engaged in activity groups that they are interested in and where they feel safe. So based on that, the UK developed this schema where people could actually be referred into activity groups with like-minded people, gardening, singing, and even yoga. And research has been showing for a number of years now that people who are engaged in social prescribing schemes present to the health services in this country 20% to 40% less, depending upon the region that they're doing the research within. So that's huge. And when we're talking about a national health system, those kind of savings really, really matter, right? Now, what happened was the Yoga and Healthcare Alliance, which is another organization that I created, but I run it with a bunch of other people. We were actually commissioned by the West London CCG, that's like an area of the country that puts together health services, to create a social prescribing program that would be directly evaluated within the community. It was successful at increasing patient activation. When patients are more activated to take care of their health, then they show up at the health services less. So it's a direct indication of reduced healthcare utilization. And also many other markers were improved. And it was so successful that we then created a training program for that intervention. We've trained over 300 teachers, and throughout the United Kingdom, they're all working in their little hatchments to try to get funding. It's not like they snap their fingers and they get it, but when 300 different people integrate and talk and enter clinics and hospitals and community centers, big things happen. So that's occurring. We also have the all-party parliamentary group for yoga and society, where we have parliamentarians that interact with I wanted to say the laity, but that's kind of what we are, the non-parliamentarians, to discuss yoga's integration into different pillars of society. And it was somewhat dormant during the pandemic, but we're really looking to reinvigorate it right now and to nominate people to focus on different areas like education, children's health, prisons, mental health care that's not mental health care, and etc. So that's going on, and I'm the secretariat of that. And then the Minded Institute, and this is the newest thing, which I'm really excited about, is talking right now to one of our national accreditation bodies about adding a certain amount of hours to our course so that our graduates are, and it gets complicated, integrative yoga therapy psychotherapists. And because the health system already accepts psychotherapists, it would be a direct inroads. That doesn't necessarily mean that they would be commissioned within the National Health Service, the NHS, because psychotherapists do often work privately. Some of them work in the NHS, but it is a clear pathway for being within, if not public healthcare, private healthcare that is already understood. There's an entire comprehension of what that means. So we're at the precipice of that. Please, all of you, cross your fingers for me that we succeed, because it is not a guarantee. And that will be a huge jump for the field in this nation.
So in short, what is the mantra we should be repeating to put good prana and energy towards the adoption of, what did you call it? Integrative yoga therapy, psychotherapist. What should our mantra be?
Yoga enhances wellness. May it spread. I think that's enough. Yeah.
Beautiful.
And in whatever way it does, I always feel really uncomfortable making personal goals that I should have. Like, as soon as I have that kind of some culpa, I'm like, no, you can't have a selfish goal. Just have a collective one.
Yeah. But I think what amazes me about you, and has for many years now, is your ability to have the bigger vision for everyone. Like, a lot of people are just interested in, how do I keep my little corner of the world safe, my family, my finances, my business. Your mind is opened up to something much bigger. You spend so much time volunteering your time to start making these huge inroads with government bodies, with academia, doing research. I mean, none of that is paid. That's you being of service to the world. And I find that inspirational in today's day and age, almost shocking, because so few people are doing that. So thank you.
Thank you, Amy. I don't think about it a lot. I guess, I came from affluence and all I saw was misery. I also have been poor in this life, and I also learned that sucks. So I'm not saying there isn't a value, but what I learned from watching the people around me was that money was certainly not going to make me happy. And what seemed to lead to happiness in my life and the lives of others was purpose. So I certainly need enough money to do the things that I need to do, to not worry how I'm going to shelter myself and eat. And that's really important, because I've actually lived at a time where I had to live in the ghetto with people that were not nice to me and couldn't afford, like even a Starbucks chai ever. I don't want that. But I think having purpose is so much more important in terms of my well-being than having money. And I believe in this. And I came out of the monastery when I really do believe in the enlightenment vision, the idea that, I can undo all of my karma and blend with the allness of things, or let go of ego, however you describe it. So I better be doing something useful for the world. Otherwise, what am I doing? Go back.
Well said. Well said. We will get to come back and try again. So that's what I always tell myself. Well, you might as well do it this time, because, who knows what kind of family or situation or, environmental problems we could be born into in the next life. Like we have a good shot here. We're in a good place to make a difference.
Do you know what the Buddha said? And I know we're almost on time. And I think about this. Obviously, it's, a metaphor ad infinitum, and not like to the highest degree, but it's a nice thing to consider. He said, having a lifetime where you can engage in deep spiritual practice and having the opportunity to really do it and have the wisdom to is as rare, wait for it. The entire oceans of the earth were frozen over. You were a tortoise, and there was only one hole in the entirety of the ocean, and you found that one hole and stuck your head up to breathe. He said, given that it is that rare, don't waste it.
I completely agree and love that.
Yeah.
There's two things I just want to ask you about. First of all, I
Sure.
just want to show your website, the Minded Institute. I think it's really important that people see the website, especially if they're watching this. We're going to take the podcast and have the video version on YouTube soon. So right now we're just on all the major audio podcast platforms, but eventually we're going to, by May 2nd, 2022, we're going to introduce the new YouTube channel for the Yoga Therapy Hour. And so when I show something on the screen, like your website, which is themindedinstitute.com, in the video version, people will get to see all that you're doing. And it's so remarkable. But you also have a book that you've co-edited on yoga, meditation, and mental health. Could you tell us about that book briefly?
Sure. So Kelly Birch and I co-edited that book. We brought together leading clinicians on various different mental health conditions in order to talk about how yoga and yoga therapy could be beneficial for these different conditions. And each chapter was co-written by somebody who was a yoga therapist and somebody who was either a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And it's quite a deep dive looking at the health condition, looking at the health condition through a yogic lens, the neuroscience or the neurocorrelates to be specific associated with the condition, and then best practices and precautions, and how to integrate it also if you're a psychological therapist, some points. I co-authored 2 of the chapters, and I also helped on a 3rd one. And Amy, I should note as well that Paul Fox and I have another book coming out on the 21st of June called Yoga on Prescription. So
tell us a little bit about that. I didn't even realize that was coming out so soon.
Yeah. So I feel like it's really been Paul's baby. I want to credit him with that. He's worked much harder on it than I have. And it's basically talking about how we were able to bring yoga into healthcare through social prescription in this country. We're still working towards that vision, the components of the program, why they worked, the outcomes for research, and what other people might consider if they also want to build programs like this in their neck of the woods, and how to be successful in that process. So it's kind of this is why yoga should be in healthcare. This is how we managed to bring it into our neck of the woods. This is our program, and here are some takeaways if you want to do something similar.
And who's the publisher on that one if people want to go find it?
That is Singing Dragon. I love that name, Singing Dragon.
Isn't it nice?
Yes. Yeah.
Out of the UK.
Out of the UK. And I want to actually note one other thing, which is if people are interested in the Minded Institute, Chris YIHA, I hope I'm not saying his name wrong, created the most beautiful video recently, free of charge. It was a gift to the Institute about us. And I feel like it gives the most comprehensive picture, at least of our diploma program. So maybe we can link that as well. It's on YouTube. It's
gorgeous. I watched it and I sent it to my producer, Adam Satchel from Narodha Productions. And I said, Adam, we need one of these. This is what we need. And it is so well done and so comprehensive. I had no idea that was gifted to you. When I looked at that, I thought, ooh, she must have had to pay big bucks for that. But how beautiful to have someone gift that to you.
I think it would have cost
that shows thousands. The support that you have, the people that see the good work you're doing in the world.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to him. Yeah.
Could you spell his name? Just so
I have to. Okay, let me hold on, because I hope other people in the United Kingdom consider using him. He's just an absolute star, and he is a very serious practitioner as well. Like right now, he's currently on a silent month-long meditation retreat. So it's Haywood. So it's Chris Hay, like Hey Wood, Chris Haywood. So he deserves so much respect and accolades from me for doing that. And I was told by somebody that knows him that he is phenomenal, but I didn't know until he did this.
We'll link it in the show notes, not to show his work, but also to show what you're doing. I mean, it is such a beautiful, I think it's 12 minutes or something, showing exactly what you're doing at the Minded Institute. And I know you have a new course that starts in the spring, I think April. Do you have any slots left, or are you completely full already?
I think we have one. We would only have one if we have a slot. But we're going to be opening up the 2023, and it's a really exciting year to join us, because hopefully that will be the cohort, which we already know for sure. Hopefully that it is also for those people that want to increase the hours, a psychotherapy course. Yeah.
Whew. Well, you are a powerhouse for such, you're like a compact little gymnast woman with just prana bursting out of you. And I love you. I support you.
I love you too.
And I'm happy to be your friend. So, thank you.
I'm really, I'm honored to be your friend, Amy. You're amazing. And for anybody that doesn't know, I'm 5 feet tall. So that's what she means. Like I'm a little tiny thing. I'm slight, little. Yeah. You can't tell on this camera.
Oh, well, thank you, Heather.
Thank you.
I feel so grateful that Heather shared her knowledge and her wisdom and did all of this research to come up with the latest studies out there, keeping us on track, knowing that research is important, as well as the experiential teachings of yoga, where we actually do a practice every single morning. As she said, hour pranayama and meditation, maybe some asana. It's really important that we have that research to connect with healthcare workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, health education departments. And it's really important that we're doing that yoga practice every day so that we're actually embodying what it is that we're teaching and not just analyzing it from the intellect, as she had that experience in her master's program. So, number one takeaway is personal sadhana, daily practice, making time for it, and embodying the teachings so that we can pass that on to others. And the other kind of big takeaway for me is Heather has this great balance between making an impact in the world, running a business, which can be antithetical to having a deep spiritual practice. She and I have talked about this, like being a business owner, if you will. We hate to call what we do a business, but let's face it, there are components that have to run well, such as marketing and sales and accounting. Like it has to function so that we can do the work that we care about. It's kind of inevitable. Even though we don't like to think of it as a business, we have to be smart business women, both she and I, and many of you out there too. And I think a lot of yoga people don't want to do that part. They don't want to get involved with government bodies. They don't want to write grants. They don't want to get accredited by academic institutions. They don't want to do research studies because they just want to feel good and teach yoga. And I think there's a place for that. But I also want to challenge us to push into some of those areas that maybe we don't know how to do. I mean, I'll admit it. I did not know how to be a businesswoman. In my first maybe 15 years in the field, it was all about teaching yoga and hoping the books worked out and sometimes falling short. I remember one time I had a 2-week training and I had already rented the space and I had already, accepted students and their deposits. And as we got closer to the date, I realized I don't even have enough students to break even. I'm going to have to pay to rent the space, to get food, and to do this training. And you know what? I did it. And it was a very painful experience to put that much time and energy into something I love, but not have the prana coming back to support the work I want to do in the world. I don't need to be rich. And I think, Heather's feels the same. It's not like we're doing this to make money, right? It's not that. But at a certain point, if you can't sustain yourself, then you don't get to do the work that you love and make a difference in the world. So it was at that point where I decided I have to get my business in order. And I went to a local college And I paid $54 for an entire semester of classes in a women's business center. It was grant funded by the state of California. And so I only had to pay $54 and I could go to any classes I wanted. I could go to QuickBooks, could go to budgeting, I could go to, marketing. So I would work all day. I'd get up at like 5 a.m., do my practices, work all day. And then from 6 to 10 p.m., I would go and learn business, basically get like a master's degree in business. And I did that for maybe 2.5 years. And it was painful because it was an hour away from my house. So if the class got done at 10 p.m., then I'd have to drive up the mountain and then get up at 5 the next day and do it. But the result of those efforts and several business courses since then that I've taken online is that I have a sustainable business. I'm taking in enough money to pay my people. I understand my budget and how not to go over it. I understand my bottom line and how to make sure that I have enough students to pay my teachers. And if that isn't happening, where can I cut back and do the teaching myself? And my stress level is so much less. I don't have to worry about disappointing people, and especially myself. And I can do my work in the world, and I feel confident about that. So it's gotten to the point where I'm actually retiring from my university job that I've been at for 25 years. I'm retiring in May 2022 because I am a businesswoman. I'm a businesswoman with the heart of a yogi. I can't say I enjoy keeping the books. I can't say I love marketing on social media. I can't say that, I'm like totally into running the business, but I'm capable and I'm proud of myself for figuring it out and doing it. So one thing that happened a few years ago is I saw that all of our students at the Optimal State Yoga Therapy School were having similar problems. Here they spent all this time and money getting a degree in yoga therapy, and then they had no idea how to launch into the world and actually make it a sustainable business that they could do what they love and get prana back in the form of finances and support to be able to continue the work. And I just kept seeing people drop off and go get other jobs. So they'd spend all this money getting trained, loving yoga therapy, and then figuring out like, oh, I guess I can't do this. I have to go get a job as a human resources person or whatever they had probably done prior. And so that's when we developed the Optimal State Professional Business Development course that we take 11 months to teach people how to get out there in the world. And it may sound like a business course, but it's actually very, very deep spiritual work to figure out who am I? What are my gifts? What is my why? How can I best be of service to the world? How can I have a good lifestyle, work balance, and still take care of myself and my family? Like all of that is packed into our business course. So for me, it feels like the final exam of yoga therapy. Like, okay, now can you really go do this? Can you actually take what you've learned through all these yoga texts, all your pranayama, all your asana, all your yoga philosophy, and can you apply it to your life in a successful way that allows you to live your svadharma, your personal purpose for being here? And most of my students tell me it's the most yogic course of anything that we teach because it's the application and doing it in real time and figuring out how to have a sustainable life, that it's actually the hardest course they take, but it's also the most yogic course because it's where the rubber hits the road. There's no like cognizing I'm such an advanced, spiritually conscious yogi. It's like, can you pay your bills and can you do this work you love? How do you balance those two? And so I'm really proud of our business course. And when I was listening to Heather in this interview, I was like, she has mastered this. I don't know how she did it. I don't know if she went to school like I did, but she has mastered that balance of being in business as well as staying in the experience of yoga and really having the heart of being of service to the world. And I really appreciate that about her because I don't think there's a lot of people out there that have mastered that. And I think that it shows that she's living her yoga. So if you have any interest in kind of leveling up your business skills and bringing yourself to the table, we have this 11-month professional business development course through the Optimal State. It's open to anyone, yoga teachers, yoga therapists, even other healthcare providers that want to be entrepreneurial and kind of go out on their own. And we start it every May. And so we start a new group May 2nd, 2022. And we'll put the link in the show notes about how you can find out more about that course, because it's only 90 days away that we're gonna start this whole new group. So thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you next week. Hey, did you know that each week on the podcast, we give you a free infographic that you can use with your clients, your students, or for your own personal studies? So check out the show notes. There's a link on where you can sign up. And not only will we send you the infographic from this week, but if there's a topic that's similar in the future, we'll also put you on that list. And we'll never sell your data or send you things that you haven't asked for. Thank you for listening to our show today. If you enjoyed this podcast, please share the episode with a friend or colleague. We're so grateful you're willing to share. Also, you could write us a review on most major platforms that host podcasts. Give us 5 stars if you appreciate the show, and tell us what you love so that we can do more of that. Finally, we support several nonprofit organizations through this podcast. See the show notes to understand how you can help. If you'd like to be a guest or a sponsor for this program, contact us at the email welcome@theoptimalstate.com. welcome@theoptimalstate.com. And finally, a special thank you to our team here at Optimal State. We are truly a global family. George Mantuan, one of our executive producers. Adam Satchel, senior media producer and sound engineer from the Philippines. Krishna Panchal, a producer from Canada. Modupe Abdullahi, who does the show notes and is an editor for us from Nigeria. And Peter Morley, who wrote and produced the music for this show, who lives in Australia. Find more about Peter's work at www.zenmusic.biz. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.